There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode includes discussions of hate crimes, murder, and suicide. Use your discretion to decide whether this episode is right for you.
A man calls a phone number in Manhattan. His name is Johnny, and he has a confession. The phone line connects him to Mr. Apology, a man whose real name is Allan Bridge, an artist performing a long-form social experiment. There are posters up all around New York City, inviting amateurs, professionals, criminals who have wronged people. It continues. It is to people that you must apologise, not to the state, not to God. Get your misdeeds off your chest. The instructions read, describe in detail what you have done and how you feel about it. The messages were to be recorded and at some point played for the public. Johnny's voice bellowed down the receiver. He spread AIDS knowingly to both genders, he confessed. It was the 1980s and the AIDS crisis was rapidly accelerating. It seemed Johnny had no desire to change. Johnny's voice was among thousands and thousands who would call the hotline over 15 years. Some were ordinary civilians. Some were criminals. Their confessions were shocking, and the project itself would take its toll on Mr. Apology. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Marissa Bridge, whose husband Allan ran the conceptual art project known as the Apology Line. Marissa, how did you meet Allan Bridge?
I met Allan one night at a bar in Tribeca, a downtown area of New York City. I was 24 and I was out with my friend from college and we were just out cruising. We went to this artist bar that someone had told me about, and Allan and his roommate Yuri were standing at the bar, and I noticed them and I thought, those guys are really interesting looking. Before too long, Allan came up to me and asked me if I wanted to dance, which I didn't really want to do right then and there, but I said, let's talk. So we ended up talking for hours and I ended up going home with him.
What attracted you to him? Because you had quite a few common interests. What were some of those interests at the beginning?
Well, we were both artists, for one thing. And, we liked to have fun. We lived in New York City. We liked to go to clubs. We liked kind of oddball things and sort of unusual things. And we had similar backgrounds. I grew up in the Midwest and he grew up in Washington, but we were both middle-class kids. And I think that was something that we felt comfortable with each other on that level.
When did you first learn about the Apology Line?
Well, Allan told me about it the first night that I met him, but I didn't understand what it was because I didn't know really what an answering machine was. Hard to believe, but I didn't have one and I didn't know anybody that had one. It was new technology back in 1980. So he told me he had to set up a telephone and an answering machine and he was collecting apologies from people. I thought, okay, I have no idea what that really means, but sounds interesting. And it wasn't until a week later when he played me some of the calls that I began to understand what he was doing, that he had actually put out a phone number and people saw the number on posters and they actually called and spoke about their secrets and their confessions, their sadnesses. And it was really, truly amazing because I'd never, except for my own childhood confessions in a Catholic confessional, I had no way of knowing really what people were thinking inside. There was no way back then. It was before the internet and there was no way to really ever know what was inside people's minds. So it really was incredible.
Did he tell you what had attracted him to this idea or where it had come from?
Yes, he started the apology line because he had been a lifelong shoplifter, and he made some machines that had moral issues embedded in them. For example, one was called the cooperation machine, and it took two people to make it work, which was having a marble drop. And he made another machine called Crime Time, where you spun a wheel of chance and you put your hand in this tube, and you either got your hand stuck in there for 30 seconds, meaning you got caught doing a crime, or you didn't get caught and a marble dropped out and you got your spoils, which you got away with the crime. So Allan told me that that machine was his own veiled confession, that he had been a lifelong shoplifter and he wanted people to know about his criminal past. So that's what he did. And he actually stopped shoplifting after that. So he thought to himself, if he could make a machine that would help other people stop their bad behavior, that he would do it. And he thought up the answering machine and the telephone and put up posters all around Manhattan, and people started calling from the very first day.
What were some of those early confessions that people called in with?
Well, there were so many early confessions. One of the early ones was a young woman who said she steals from stores and she's gotten caught. And she was a teenager and her mother was involved. She had to go to the police. Another one was a 14-year-old boy got his girlfriend pregnant and no one knew but the girl and her mother. And then there was someone who called and confessed to mugging homosexuals and killing one. So it really ran the gamut from sort of minor crimes of stealing to muggings and murder.
Did Allan have a plan about what he was going to do with all of these confessions or what the end game was? Or was this sort of a work in progress and he wanted to see where it took him?
Well, it was a work in progress, but from the very beginning, he told the callers that he would play the calls back in a public space because back then there was no way for the callers to hear the calls. The answering machine technology wasn't developed, so there was no way he could put a playback program on, which he ended up doing in 1983. But the first few years he couldn't do that. So he found a venue, the New Museum, which is an art museum in New York City, offered to put him in an exhibition. And he played the tapes back to the public. He got the phone company to donate 4 phone booths. And he took apart the phone box and put a cassette player inside. So when a person walked into the phone booth and lifted their receiver, they would hear an ongoing loop of the apology calls from that first year. So that was his original goal, and he achieved that early on. But it wasn't enough because he knew that he needed to keep the line going. So he ended up figuring out by 1983 how to play the calls back through the telephone and bring the calls right back to the people.
You mentioned that there were people calling and confessing to crimes. Did he have an incentive or a motivation to solve the crimes? I know that at one stage police contacted him wanting to investigate a crime about a man who beat and robbed gay men. Was Allan cooperative?
He was cooperative, and that's something that we cover episode 1 of the podcast. Yes, he felt that he was obligated to have the police involved if someone was confessing to murder. So there were a couple of times where the police did work with Allan. That was the first time, and that was in the first couple of weeks the line started. And then from 1984 to 1989, a self-confessed serial killer named Richie called, and the police also got involved in that case.
What did Allan learn about Richie? Because they developed quite a relationship, didn't they?
Yes, they did. They had a very involved relationship over the telephone. Allan was fascinated with Richie because Richie was very well-spoken. He was even-tempered, and he, in a very matter-of-fact voice, explained all these horrible things that he did to men. He also said he picked up gay men and tortured and murdered them. Allan really wanted to understand why he did what he did. He wanted to be able to stop him and catch him. And if he couldn't do anything else, he was hoping that Richie would commit suicide. So he was definitely extremely motivated to get Richie to stop his behavior any way that he could.
And Richie even sent Allan evidence or tried to send evidence that he was who he said he was. Did that convince Allan?
Well, Richie sent, I wouldn't say conclusive evidence. He sent photographs. We were never sure whether those photographs were staged or actual real victims. He sent drawings of very nasty things that he had done, very terrible drawings. But he never sent more conclusive proof, and Allan didn't want him to because he didn't want Richie killing someone just to send Allan proof, because that would have defeated the purpose of getting the proof from him. What he was requesting from Richie was dog tags from someone, because New York City is a big port, and there's lots of servicemen that come in all year long. Richie had said he picked up some sailors and Marines and this and that. So he wanted some evidence like that, a driver's license, dog tags from a serviceman, things that wouldn't force Richie to have to do a crime like a finger or a body part was not acceptable. And Allan did not want him to send anything like that.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Marissa Bridge, the host of the Apology Line podcast. Were either of you scared that you were opening up this relationship with a man who claimed to be a serial killer and sounded, according to detectives and other experts, like a psychopath? Were you scared for your safety at any point?
It's funny. I heard Richie's calls, and I don't know if we were scared for Richie to come to our house and harm us. I don't think we had that kind of fear. What I was afraid of more was of Allan's psychological involvement and emotional involvement with Richie. To me, that was much more frightening than the idea of Richie coming to our house. I thought there was a very low probability. Richie was enjoying the attention from Allan so much that he wouldn't want to hurt Allan, because then he wouldn't have anyone to talk to and brag about all these things. So no, it was a different kind of fear. And it was a more real fear in a sense, because Allan did go down the rabbit hole and get very involved with Richie. And he would read books about understanding the criminal mind and understanding the psychopath and all these really heavy books. And I've noticed that a lot of police detectives and people that are really into serious crimes like serial killers, they get very deeply involved in all of this. And they probably have training. I would assume police detectives have training in how to cope with it, but Allan didn't have that training. And so he just got very emotionally involved, and it was really hard for him to come back from that.
He descended into almost wanting to get closer to evil and to fully understand it and explore what it meant. And at one point, he even tried to find Richie. What did he do, and how did that end up?
Well, he found out where Richie lived, and the police detective who he was working with did not want him to do that. But against Detective Ray Pierce's wishes, he went to Richie's house and scoped it out. And Richie had claimed to have picked up people in Times Square, the area in New York City where Port Authority, there's a lot of homeless people, a lot of drifters. Port Authority is a big bus station where people come from all over the U.S. to land in New York City with only a few dollars in their pocket. So it's a known area for crime and for picking up people. And so Allan went looking for him there as well.
Allan had relationships with other people who called the hotline as well. Did he ever answer the phone and talk back to people? And if so, what did he say, and what were those relationships about?
Yes, well, Allan, from the very beginning of the Apology Line, had stated that if someone wanted to talk to him privately, he would speak to them. So he did do that. He wouldn't pick up the phone while someone was actually speaking. He actually did do that once or twice, and it scared the callers so much that they immediately hung up. So he learned early on that was not a good thing to do, because people were in their own private space when they're calling, and they don't expect anyone to be listening. So yes, he did. He called early on. There was a woman who called and said she'd been raped, and he spoke to her at great length. He spoke to Richie. He spoke to a man called Jumpin' Jim, who claimed to have killed his mother, and he wanted to speak to Allan. And that actually became a story in the New Yorker magazine.
Allan did this for years and years and was seeing almost into the souls of Americans and their deepest, darkest secrets. What emotional toll do you think it eventually took on him and by extension you as the person who was living with him?
Well, it took an enormous emotional toll. When you're the person that is on the receiving end of all people's secrets and confessions, there's a lot of pain and suffering and negativity that was coming through the line all day long. And Allan couldn't ignore that. He wasn't just running the system. He listened to every single call, and he made program tapes every 2 weeks. He edited down the best calls. So he was listening intently to everything. And that was really an emotional burden on him. And the line just got more and more popular as the years went on. And he ended up having 3 telephone lines in 1991. And then by 1994, he got a voice mailbox system. So not only did he have the 3 phone lines, but there was a voicemail technology with all these different boxes, or people could leave messages for other callers. And it just blew up into this huge thing. And he wasn't making any money off of it. He was supporting the line. And he tried to start a zine, a magazine in 93 to make some money. And he ran that for 2 years. And it was actually breaking even when he passed away, but it was an enormous amount of work too. So not only was he running the line full time, but he was doing a zine quarterly, and it was a crushing burden for him. And it was not sustainable.
What was his mental health and his mental state like towards the end of his life?
The last year of his life, he was very depressed. And he was realizing that this project that he'd done for so many years was not something that was going to be able to sustain him financially, but it wasn't something he could walk away from. So he just got more and more depressed about it. There's the myth of Sisyphus, where this man pushes a rock up a hill, and then the next day he wakes up and the rock is at the bottom of the hill and he has to start over, and it's a never-ending pushing the boulder up the hill. That is what Allan's life was like. No matter how much he accomplished in a given day, the next day there'd be that many more calls, and he'd have to start all over again, recording them all, listening to them all, classifying them all. And it was very depressing. He turned 50 the year he died, and he was very upset about that. And he really didn't know how to end the line, and he didn't know where his life was going.
And when he was 50, he was scuba diving, which was one of his great loves, and I know that it was something you learned to love as well. And he was fatally hit by a jet ski. Did you ever find out who that person was, and would you like to know who that person was?
Yes, that person was never found. There were 2 witnesses who were sitting on the rocks near the jetty where he was killed, and they saw Allan coming up from the water, and a jet skier just unfortunately was right there and hit him. And the jet skier circled around and came back. We don't know what that person saw, if they saw Allan and knew they'd hit a person, or maybe they thought they hit a rock or a turtle or something else floating in the water, and they took off. So we don't know what happened. And that person never came forward, even though it was widely publicized in Long Island where the accident occurred. It was on the television news, it was in all the papers, and the police did an extensive search because they had a description of the jet ski, but they could never make an arrest. And I have to say, they wouldn't have arrested the person unless they had seen that they had hit him and then took off. That would have been a crime because they just left him in the water. And maybe he could have been saved if they would have pulled him out. That's an unknown, but no, they never found the person. And I would like to know who the person was if they're still alive. I think it would be a very healing thing for that person and for me.
And that was, of course, Allan's life work, was to have people confess and hope that there was some absolution or some healing in the process of confessing. And perhaps that's what Allan would have wanted that person to do. And the final thing I wanted to ask was, through listening to those calls, and you listened to so many of them alongside Allan and talked about it for almost your whole relationship, what did you learn about humanity and the secrets we hold and what we don't tell other people? What were the major lessons that you drew from that period of your life?
There's a couple of things I learned. One of them is that the act of confessing and the act of apologizing is a big release. It's a release of pain and it's a release of suffering, as well as the act of forgiving someone else. When you get to the point where you can forgive someone, that releases you as well. And you have a sense of freedom. And that was something that I saw over and over again with the apology line. And the other thing I think is perhaps even more important is how similar we all are under the surface. We all have the same hopes and dreams. We all have the same pain and suffering. When you hear someone talking about being left by someone they loved, we know what that pain is, and we all feel it. And I think that, especially in the United States, where we're such a divided country, just to remember that we're all the same under the surface and have some empathy and compassion for your fellow human being. I think that's the primary message of the apology line. And aside from that is forgive people that have harmed you. And if you're the person that's done the harming, please apologize. Everyone will feel better and you'll heal your relationships.
Marissa's husband, Allan Bridge, known to New Yorkers as Mr. Apology, dedicated 15 years of his life to the apology line. What started as a small conceptual art project took on a life of its own and became his lifelong work. Marissa documented this work in a 6-part podcast series called The Apology Line. You can find a link to it in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri and our producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.